T is 22nd May 1944, and the night sky above the Rhine Valley pulses with the drone of aircraft engines. The bombers are not Lancasters loaded with explosives, nor Mosquitoes carrying incendiary payloads. Instead, these aircraft return from a mission of a different kind entirely. Their holds are empty not because they have discharged their cargo of death, but because they have dispersed something far more insidious. Millions upon millions of printed sheets, fluttering down through the darkness like confetti. By morning, the German soldiers in their trenches and bunkers across northern Europe will wake to find their positions carpeted with paper. This is Psyop, psychological operations, and the British have just perfected it into something genuinely formidable. Within months, German commanders will report entire units rendered combat ineffective not by artillery fire or machine gun barrages, but by the simple, devastating power of the printed word. The weapon has no name that appears in official records. No technical specification sheet exists detailing its mechanical function. There is no photograph of it mounted on a tank or carried by a soldier. Yet, by the final year of the Second World War, military planners on both sides recognized it as one of the most strategically significant innovations of the conflict. The British had developed a system of producing, distributing, and deploying propaganda material on a scale, and with an efficiency that transformed psychological warfare from an amateur pursuit into an industrial operation. They had created what was, in effect, an invisible army, one that required no ammunition, inflicted no physical wounds, yet left entire German formations desolate, paranoid, and operationally paralyzed. This is the story of how paper became Britain's most dangerous weapon in the latter stages of the war. What makes this innovation particularly remarkable is that it achieved something that conventional weaponry often could not. It made the enemy question the very ground beneath their feet. Soldiers live within tight frameworks of certainty. They follow orders, they trust their officers, they believe in the righteousness of their cause. But what happens when that certainty fractures? What happens when the very thing you are supposed to shoot at starts telling you the truth? The British learned to exploit the psychology of occupation, the homesickness of conscripted soldiers far from their families, the growing awareness amongst the German rank and file that the war was already lost, and they learned to do it with industrial precision. By May 1944, the Allies stood at the threshold of liberation. Within weeks, Operation Overlord would begin. But before the invasion launched, Britain had already begun a campaign that would prove almost as important as any infantry assault. This was the moment when Britain weaponized the printing press. Understanding this campaign requires us first to understand the desperation that preceded it. When the war in Europe began in earnest in 1940, Britain faced a problem that no amount of conventional military power could easily solve. Germany had conquered France in 6 weeks. The Low Countries had fallen. The Wehrmacht stood triumphant across the continent, and Britain stood alone, separated from the enemy by the Channel and little else. For 4 years, large portions of Europe would remain under German occupation. The populations of Belgium, France, Netherlands, Poland, and a dozen other nations lived under Nazi rule, subjected to exploitation, conscription, and the ever-present machinery of totalitarian control. Ordinary soldiers from these occupied territories were often pressed into German military service. Millions of German soldiers themselves were exhausted, far from home, increasingly aware that their nation's ambitions of European domination were unraveling before their eyes. The military options available to the Allies throughout the first 5 years of the war were brutally limited. You could bomb German cities, but this produced a rallying effect as much as a demoralizing one. You could mount commando raids, but these touched only the tiniest fraction of the occupied continent. You could train resistance movements, but they were scattered, poorly coordinated, and frequently penetrated by German intelligence. What you could not do was reach the minds of millions of occupied civilians and conscripted soldiers directly. That is, until someone realized that you could do precisely that through the simple expedient of flying over enemy territory at night and scattering millions of printed leaflets across the landscape. The concept was not new. Propaganda leaflets had been dropped sporadically throughout the war by various Allied powers. However, these earlier efforts were desultory, poorly coordinated and produced by different organizations working at cross purposes. What was needed was systematization. The British, with their characteristic approach to industrial problems, decided to apply the principles of mass production to the business of demoralization. They would create an entire bureaucratic apparatus dedicated to the manufacturing, distribution, and psychological targeting of propaganda. They would turn leaflet operations into something resembling a factory line. And they would do this with sufficient sophistication that each individual leaflet would be carefully designed to appeal to specific audiences: German soldiers of particular regions, members of specific military branches, conscripted soldiers from particular nations, even civilians in particular occupations. The facility responsible for this vast operation was obscurely named the Political Warfare Executive, or PWE, located in central London but coordinating with other departments. Alongside this was the Air Ministry, whose bombers would serve as the distribution mechanism. From early 1942 onwards, these organizations began developing the infrastructure required to produce propaganda on an unprecedented scale. The challenge was multifaceted. How do you print millions of leaflets, each perfectly suitable for its intended audience? How do you ensure they reach German-occupied territory rather than falling into the sea or being scattered uselessly across the channel? How do you time their release to coincide with moments of maximum psychological impact? How do you prevent the enemy from simply collecting them and burning them, rather than reading them? These were engineering problems as much as they were psychological ones, and the British approached them with characteristic methodical precision. The technical solution was both elegant and ruthlessly practical. The PWE's print facilities, working around the clock, produced leaflets on industrial presses at a rate that would have astonished earlier propagandists. Where previous leaflet campaigns measured their output in thousands, the PWE's operations would eventually measure output in the hundreds of millions. They established a printing operation that employed hundreds of staff, from design specialists who understood the psychology of persuasion to production managers who understood the mathematics of distribution. The layouts were carefully considered. The language was precise, often translated by native speakers to ensure not merely that the German was correct, but that it was psychologically authentic. That is, it sounded like something a German soldier might actually say to himself. The design of individual leaflets followed strict principles. Never, under any circumstances, should a leaflet appear to be cheap or hastily produced. A German soldier would dismiss a poorly made leaflet as enemy propaganda, and precisely for that reason it would fail its purpose. Instead, every leaflet was produced to a standard that matched or exceeded legitimate German military publications. The paper stock was equivalent to what ordinary German printing used. The typography was professional. The images were carefully chosen or, where necessary, manufactured using techniques that would convince a viewer they were genuine. This was industrial production meeting psychological warfare, and the British understood that the medium itself was part of the message. The mechanics of distribution required equal precision. RAF bombers and later specialized aircraft would carry leaflets in place of conventional ordnance. The leaflets were packaged in containers that would open at a predetermined altitude, distributing their contents across a target area with surprising accuracy. The RAF developed bombing patterns specifically designed to ensure that leaflets reached their intended zones. Intelligence reports suggested that a successful leaflet drop over enemy territory could result in leaflets reaching millions of individuals across an area of thousands of square kilometers. The coordination between the PWE's production facilities and RAF Bomber Command's aircraft required meticulous planning. Targets would be selected, leaflet designs would be approved, printing runs would be initiated, packaged materials would be transported to airfields, and sorties would be scheduled. When weather permitted and operational tempo allowed, the bombs would fall, not explosively, but as paper. The content of these leaflets evolved dramatically as the war progressed and as the British refined their understanding of psychological effect. Early leaflets often took the form of straightforward propaganda, appeals to reason, statements about German atrocities, suggestions that surrender was inevitable. As the operation matured, the approach became far more sophisticated. The British began producing leaflets designed to appear as though they had been produced by dissident German groups or even by the German military itself. They created leaflets that appeared to contain secret information about German military movements, designed to increase paranoia and distrust within the military hierarchy. They produced leaflets specifically targeting soldiers from particular regions, referencing their hometowns, their families, the economic situation in their provinces. They created leaflets designed to undermine confidence in German officers or to suggest that certain units were deliberately being sent to the front lines to be destroyed. They produced leaflets that appeared to show casualty statistics or to reveal Allied battle plans in a way that made surrender seem rational. The sophistication of approach matched the sophistication of the distribution network. If you find this exploration of psychological warfare compelling, do please consider subscribing. The true history of modern conflict often lies not in the dramatic impact of explosives, but in the quieter, more insidious workings of information and persuasion. The operational deployment of leaflet operations reached its crescendo from 1943 onwards, and particularly during the build-up to and aftermath of D-Day. In May 1944, alone, RAF operations dropped over 100 million leaflets across German-occupied territories and Germany itself. These were not random distributions. They were targeted with increasing precision. During the Normandy campaign, leaflets were specifically designed to convince German soldiers that Allied landings had succeeded, that German defenses had failed, and that surrender was inevitable. Military reports captured during or after the campaigns occasionally contained references to these leaflets. German soldiers had picked them up, had read them, and the effect on morale was evidently significant enough that commanders felt obliged to mention it in their intelligence reports. The leaflets took many forms as the war continued. Some appeared as safe conduct passes, designed to look like legitimate German military documents that supposedly allowed the bearer safe passage through Allied lines. German soldiers who picked these up faced a psychological dilemma. Was this a trick? Would the leaflet actually protect them if they crossed Allied lines? The uncertainty itself became a tool. Other leaflets were designed to appear as internal German military communications, with unit numbers and officer names that were genuine, discussing tactical situations in a way that seemed authentic. The intention was to make German officers paranoid about security breaches, to convince them that their movements were being tracked, that their plans were known. Still, other leaflets targeted specific vulnerabilities. Letters were dropped designed to look as though they came from relatives of German soldiers, begging them to come home, or expressing despair about conditions on the home front. The psychological impact of receiving a letter that seemed to be from one's own family, appearing in a leaflet dropped by the enemy, was significant. By 1944 and 1945, German commanders were reporting that leaflet drops had a measurable effect on morale. Some units, upon encountering a fresh leaflet drop, would experience a temporary but noticeable degradation in operational effectiveness. Soldiers would spend time collecting and reading the leaflets rather than maintaining defensive positions. The circulation of leaflets among a military unit could create conditions of paranoia and distrust. When a unit received a leaflet apparently showing that their tactical position was known, or that their commanding officer was corrupt, or that their compatriots in another unit had already surrendered, The cumulative effect was demoralizing. Some German commanders began issuing standing orders that leaflets were to be immediately destroyed upon discovery, and that soldiers found reading them would be severely punished. The very stringency of these orders suggested how much the German military hierarchy feared the psychological impact of these materials. The British approach to leaflet operations differed markedly from that of the American allies. The Americans, with characteristic directness, favored leaflets that were straightforward appeals to surrender. British leaflets, by contrast, were psychologically subtle and sophisticated. They played on doubts, fears, and divisions. They exploited the differences between German soldiers conscripted from different regions. They targeted the anxiety of families left behind in occupied territories. They suggested that the war was already lost and that continuation was futile. This difference in approach reflected a broader British understanding of psychological manipulation, that indirect suggestion was often more effective than direct command. The comparison with German propaganda operations is instructive. The German military possessed sophisticated propaganda machinery and considerable technical capacity for the production of propaganda materials. However, German propaganda suffered from a fundamental disadvantage. It relied increasingly on falsehoods as the war turned against Germany. By 1944 and 1945, German soldiers and civilians knew that much of what their own government was telling them was untrue. The promises of wonder weapons, the claims of military successes, the assertions that the homeland was safe, all of these claims collapsed against the evidence of their own senses. The British leaflets, by contrast, could afford to be largely factual. They could point to actual German military setbacks. They could reference real casualties. They could appeal to genuine fears and uncertainties that German soldiers actually harbored. This fundamental advantage of factuality gave British psychological operations considerable power. The actual impact of these operations on the outcome of the war remains difficult to quantify precisely. No general ever surrendered because of a leaflet. No battle was won primarily because soldiers had been demoralized by propaganda. Yet the cumulative effect across millions of individuals was substantial. Military records suggest that leaflet operations contributed measurably to the general deterioration of German morale during the final 2 years of the war. Units that had been subjected to sustained leaflet campaigns often exhibited lower combat effectiveness. Soldiers who had been exposed to leaflets showing the hopelessness of continued resistance were marginally more likely to surrender when given the opportunity. The psychological burden of occupying vast territories full of hostile or unreliable civilians was subtly but measurably increased by the circulation of materials designed to undermine German control. In an era before precise metrics for measuring psychological impact existed, contemporaries nonetheless recognized that something significant was happening. The legacy of these operations extended far beyond the Second World War itself. The British PWE's work with leaflet operations established principles and methodologies that would influence psychological warfare operations for decades. The concept of information operations, of using carefully designed messages to achieve strategic effects without resort to conventional weaponry, became embedded in military doctrine. During the Cold War, both the Western Allies and the Soviet Union would invest heavily in similar operations. The very concept of psychological warfare as an industrial, systematized operation was substantially pioneered during these leaflet campaigns. The technical innovations in printing, distribution, and targeting would influence how propaganda was conducted throughout the latter 20th century. Today, the physical traces of these operations are scattered across European archives and private collections. Preserved leaflets, the paper itself sometimes yellowed with age, sit in files and display cases. They are printed in German, in Dutch, in French, in Polish, in languages that were the tongues of occupied Europe. Some are beautifully designed, others are crude and hastily produced. Reading them now, decades after they were scattered from RAF bombers, they seem almost quaint. Earnest appeals in a war that is long finished, designed by people long dead to persuade soldiers who have themselves long since passed away. Yet in their time, these simple pieces of paper were understood by both sides to be weapons of genuine strategic consequence. The British system of psychological operations during the Second World War represents something historically significant that is often overlooked in traditional accounts of the conflict. Where we remember Bletchley Park for its code-breaking and the RAF for its bombing campaigns, we often overlook the quiet, unglamorous work of those who recognize that wars could be won, or at least decisively influenced, not merely through the projection of explosive force, but through the careful, systematic manipulation of information and psychology. The PWE and its allied operations never received the public acclaim granted to more obviously martial endeavors. No monuments were erected to the writers, designers, and administrators who created these campaigns. Yet in their own time, military planners knew exactly what they were doing. They were waging war with information. They were using psychology as a weapon. They were dropping entire armies across enemy territory not in the form of soldiers, but in the form of ideas. When one reads period accounts of German soldiers' experiences in the final year of the war, a common thread emerges. Soldiers report feeling surrounded by uncertainty, by information that contradicted official narratives, by a mounting conviction that continuation was pointless. Some of this surely came from the soldiers' own observations of the military situation, but some came from the constant, unrelenting barrage of carefully crafted messages that rained down on them from the sky. The leaflets arrived on nights when bombers came, and on nights when no bombers came. They arrived in occupied cities and on remote stretches of front line. They addressed soldiers in their own regional dialects. They spoke to their fears and their longings. They suggested that their cause was lost, that their officers had betrayed them, that surrender was not cowardice but wisdom. Not all soldiers believed these messages, but some did, and the cumulative psychological weight across millions of individuals was substantial. This was Britain's invisible war fought with information and psychology rather than explosives and steel. It required no tanks, no artillery, no ships. It required only the capacity to understand how ordinary men think, what they fear, what they hope for, and how to shape those thoughts, fears, and hopes through carefully crafted messages. It required the industrial capacity to produce these messages at scale, and it required the will to recognize that in modern warfare, the conquest of minds might ultimately matter more than the conquest of territory. The British possessed all three of these things, and in doing so they transformed psychological warfare from an amateur's game into an industrial operation. The Germans, for all their military prowess, never quite managed the same, and in the end, perhaps, that made all the difference.